Expedia and Visit Scotland invite you to come step into centuries of history that await in Scotland. Castles steeped in legend walk along cobblestone streets. Come share the warmth of stories passed down through generations. This is a place with a past that is fully present today and all yours to explore. Plan your Scottish escape today at expedia.com/Visit Scotland.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today we're talking with author Valerie Fridland about accents, specifically the accents that we use when we speak in English. And I think this is such a timely topic because recently the trailer came out for Christopher Nolan's new movie version of The Odyssey. And among various things that various people are up in arms about with this film, one of them is, why does Matt Damon have an American accent? Why is Tom Holland using an American accent? Why aren't people talking in the British accent that we imagine everybody in all of history always spoke with? And in talking with Valerie about how people speak English, we get into that. Like, what accents did people maybe have in the past, and how can we guess what those were like? And what we think of now as the sort of British accent, the sort of fancy accent that people often have in historical costume dramas, was actually a recent accent, and people in history didn't really talk like that. I also really enjoyed talking with her about what did people maybe talk like during the founding of America? What sort of accents did people have? She's a linguist. This is a topic of Valerie's new book, which is called Why We Talk Funny, the real story behind our accents. We had Valerie on the podcast a few years ago when she's promoting her previous book, Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. I love that she's talking about how language, specifically the English language, is always developing and always changing, and people who get mad about it are just behind the times, man. Like, languages aren't frozen in amber, and they're always changing, they're always developing, accents are changing. She's such a fun person to talk to. So enjoy this conversation with Valerie Fridland, author of the new book, Why We Talk Funny, the real story behind our accents. Okay, so today we are joined for a return visit by author Valerie Fridland about her new book, Why We Talk Funny, the real story behind our accents. So you were on this podcast a few years ago with your previous book, which was talking about, your previous book, I just remember I invited you on because it was, to me, a defense of saying like in sentences, which is the way that I talk.
Right. Well, it was called Like Literally Dude. So it was kind of featuring all those things we love to hate, and especially the things that we love to hate in women. Mm-hmm. Was a big part of that.
I was happy to have you on the podcast last time because it was great talking with you, but also now when somebody leaves a bad review for my podcast saying, oh, she uses the word like, or she says, I can be like, listen to this episode. This explains why actually. Exactly.
I have it on a good authority. It actually means a lot more than you think. Right.
This is how language progresses.
Exactly. Yeah. We have such a short view of history in terms of speech and why we get the features we do. And a lot of times it's because, we don't ever learn linguistics. We don't learn language history. We learn prescriptivist history, and that's a very different thing. And so we get really annoyed by all these new features that come into language. But this is exactly the life cycle of language. And Old English is unintelligible. I mean, just go read Beowulf. No one wants that. So when we complain about these new features, we're really complaining about the very evolution of language that brought us to be speaking the way we are today. So really the goal of that book was simply to set the record straight about features like literally and like and that we love to hate, and why we do them, because they're obviously super popular. They serve a purpose. We don't just randomly do things. And so, that was really a book about people's complaints about language that they bring to me. So a lot of that was inspired inspired by the things I kept hearing. This new book is really inspired by what I have spent my career researching, and also my early life experience as the child of people with a non-native accent. So what it was like growing up in a place, the South of the United States, that has such an salient accent itself, and then having parents who had accents in that already accented place. It was a unique experience that made me incredibly aware about the social power of an accent. And then when I would talk to people, I'd find everybody has an accent story. And one is obviously we all have accents. We might not believe it, but that's because we think of accents in terms of region. So if you sound like you're from a region like the South or New York that has a salient accent, but accents tell a lot more than region. They tell us about race, gender, ethnicity, and class, age. There's all sorts of things that our accents reveal, and we don't think of that. So when I think I don't have an accent, I just don't have a noticeable accent to myself because everybody I talk to sounds like me. But if I leave my country, clearly people know I'm not from there, and they'll even often say, "Oh, you have an American accent." When I lived in Istanbul, people always tagged me for American. And, most people would say, "Oh, I don't have a super strong accent." But I obviously do, because when I left and moved to another country, people knew where I was from right away. So accents are incredibly revealing about social aspects of our lives, both because those aspects are important to us. So they talk about sort of, where we're from and who we spend time with. But also they tell people things that we might not realize they do. So, there are always complaints about young speakers, which is something I talked about a lot in my last book. And, that shows us that accents are about age, because we hear things in other people's speech. If we're young, we feel like, oh, that's old people talk. As my daughter says to me all the time, when I say something or sound like something she thinks is old. Or older adults often complain about how those young people talk. So, obviously there's so much more in our accents than people think about. And that's really what drove this book.
Well, and I can really see in terms of how you're describing your first book and this one, there's also the way that people perceive certain accents as being incorrect, or people are speaking differently, or there's like a certain way that we should be speaking, and someone with a certain accent dropping the G at the end of ing word, for instance, and you talk about that in the book as well, just kind of how there is this kind of classism, and there's sort of an assumption that certain accents, and you see it in, comedy or The Simpsons or something, when you want to have like a really stupid character, like often they do give them a Southern accent, different accents mean different things. And so I thought that was really interesting to read through your book and just explain why these accents are the way they are.
Right. There's a history behind the reasons we think of, a British RP accent as aristocratic and smart and sophisticated. But, we think of a sort of Spanish-based accent as being sort of someone from as outsider accent, and maybe someone from a more lower class background. We're very classist because of historical events and relationships that we have with speakers that come from areas where those languages are spoken, or different accents of English are spoken. And those get imbued with not just, an association with a way of speech, but also associations with a way of being, a way of presenting, and our beliefs about how smart those people are, how good those people are, right? So people that are socially lucky, that have certain accents, we then start just seeing them as socially superior and not just socially lucky. So people that have certain accents often are considered high class, like RP, because of their historical positioning. They were the place that became a cultural center, and they were the speakers that lived in that place that became a cultural center. And they were the ones that happened to have, aristocratic blood. So they were wealthy and lived in a place that was a cultural center. And so it's kind of luck of the draw that they ended up having the sophisticated accent, but then that becomes associated with how you get to that position, and somehow they're intrinsically better. And that gets put on their accent. And the same thing happens when you have a working class accent. It's imbued with all these characteristics, some good, some bad. But just like you said, Hollywood is great at understanding that social power of accents, because they cast characters with certain accents so that all these associations we have with those accents do the work of characterization. So they don't have to tell you the backstory of these characters because their accents do that for them. And it's so fascinating to me how those backstories were built by history. And that's really the story I'm telling in these books. What is the history behind the African American accent, for example, behind the American accent and, the New York accent and all those different accents that we find very salient, because I personally find that fascinating, how it tells a story that we're not aware of. It's really the story of humanity.
And your book, just, there's so many interesting examples in it. And I was like, I need to drill down. I can't ask you too many questions. We're just having a short podcast interview. But if you could, I think it would be interesting for people to understand, for example, how at the time of the American Revolution, there's this big anniversary coming up, like the schism between the British accent and the American accent. Like, at what point did those diverge in your research?
Absolutely. I think people think of the regions that are existent today and the differences between them as something that have always existed. So, the South versus the North, this antagonism we kind of see culturally and linguistically, these very salient dialects. They feel like they've been around forever, but truthfully, they really have only been around since soon after the American Revolution. Prior to that, in the early settlement of the colonies, when it was the New World and not the New Republic, there were actually bigger differences that were emergent between the American language, the dialects on the tongues of Americans, on these new colonists, and Britain. So the differences that you see written about there was shock and awe at how incredibly distinct the American language, as they called it, had become from the British language. And the other remarkable thing that you see in the late 1600s and early 1700s primarily is commentary on how similar Americans were to each other. Of course, they weren't Americans at that time. They were British subjects still, but how similar the different colonies sounded. And that's probably not completely accurate. I'm sure that, people, how when you're in the South, everybody outside the South hears a Southern accent, but people in the South or in the North, they know where someone's from within that area. So there are these differences that exist that are kind of invisible at the larger level. And I think that's really what happened. I doubt they actually sounded all that similar. But the contrast between the incredible diversity of British dialects and British accents in Britain, where, you could go to a neighboring village and they would sound completely different. And there was a lot of classism as well. Now, that really happened around 1600 and 1700, but there were remarkable differences in the accents there. And in America, or in the colonies, people sounded very uniform and also very distinct from those back in Britain. So what was really commented on until about 1780, 1790 was this uniquely American sound, New World sound.
Can I ask what the people who, like the settlers who came initially over to America, is part of it, and I think you say this in the book, they were coming from certain regions of Britain. So it was people coming over who already shared an accent. It's not a bunch of people came over with 17 different accents and they all flattened. It's just people came from one area. Is that it?
No, actually, that is it. That is about a bunch of people came over with 17 accents and they flattened. However, what set up the unique, so I think what the best answer is, the seeds of the American regions were set in play at the very first founding of the colonies. But it took a while for that tree of dialects to grow, but the seeds were there. So what happened is you had these three distinct main early colonies. So you had, the earliest one was Jamestown. And that was obviously sort of what would become the Southern accent. But at that time, it was basically settlers from the southwestern parts of Britain were the predominant areas. However, there were also people from all over. So in no colony was there just one main accent. What we do find is there was a tendency for Southern British accents to be more highly represented in the Jamestown colony and the next colony that was settled, which was the New England or the Massachusetts or Plymouth colony. That had more East Anglia sort of settlement, so southeastern Britain, but both of them were predominantly southern British in terms of the sheer numbers of people from one area. However, there were a lot of Irish, there were a lot of Welsh, there were some northern British dialects represented. There was simply not a preponderance of one group. There was a slight tendency for southern British dialects to be overrepresented in the colonies, and that seems to be what kind of shaped some of the leveling that happened. So I would say that there's both seeds of both of what you brought up. There were people from certain areas that kind of pushed the dialect in one direction, but there was such great diversity in not just where people were from, but the classes and ranks they came from. That was unheard of the kind of mixing that happened in Britain, right? Aristocrats and servants didn't mix in the way they did in the colonies. So yes, servants would have served the aristocrats, but they would never have talked like them. But in the New World, survival was the key. And you didn't have time to be, worried about who you were talking to. You built the thing together. You worked the land together. You had to survive together. You strategized together. There were also many fewer people there. And so you had this intense mixing of classes that you didn't have back in Britain. And so that was also foundational to the accents. But the basic reality is it was a vast cauldron of different dialects with slightly more Southern British in both the Jamestown and Plymouth colonies that ended up doing something we call leveling in linguistics, which means they kind of had this, sort of mixture of all these different features, and the features that were most prevalent tended to stay, and the ones that were less common tended to die out, or sometimes ones that were not maybe so prevalent, but had prestige for some reason, those ended up staying, right? So it was kind of a mixed bag of what was picked from each dialect, and that's what leveled out, and that's how we got the sort of different mixture that ended up becoming the differences between the New England accent and the Jamestown accent. But then, about 60 years later, you get Pennsylvania, and that actually was settled from very different settlers. So the Pennsylvania colony, which was settled in 1681 by William Penn, who had received a charter from King Charles II, settled with mainly a northern British group. So they were different than the southern British that had settled Jamestown and Plymouth in terms of their dialect features. And still today, the big difference between accents, larger accents in Britain, are the northern versus southern British, and that was true at that time. So that was mainly northern British because that was where a lot of the Quakers came from. But not only that, they were incredibly welcoming in a way that the Jamestown and Plymouth colonists were not. So if, New England was very tight and they had to share religion and purity and sort of this view of the world. And if not, you were really ousted. You weren't allowed to settle there. And in Jamestown, it was aristocrats, a lot of them that settled and owned the land and got the charter. So that had a whole different thing going on. It was very much in the model of Britain, where rank was important. So again, they weren't just going to let a lot of foreigners settle that area, but in Pennsylvania, the Quakers were incredibly welcoming to all, and they were much more harmonious in getting along with people from other places. So you had a huge number of Scots-Irish and German settlers that came, and it was those three groups, the Northern British, the Scots-Irish, and the Germans, that came to the Midlands, the Midland colonies, and they basically established what we know as Midwestern speech. So you could see that, there was this great mixing of people, and there were no clear dialect boundaries at this point because it was too early. What they really were doing is leveling previous speech and making this new dialect. But about 100 years later, that's when we start to see they've been around long enough and they've had enough generations of children, because children are the glue of accent.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that. Yeah.
Yes. So then they sound different. So their children then, they found innovations. I mean, the reasons we complain about young people's speech is because they're incredibly innovative. And they also take what they hear around them and they meld them into new things. And that's exactly what happened with the settlers' children. And because of these different sort of foundational accents, they they create something called founders effects, which are the cultural areas persist in time, even though the actual linguistic features may change. And it's those founders effects of these three main dialect areas that happened with the early colonists. But it wasn't for another 150 years that we start to see comments on regional accent divides. And that's about the time of the American Revolution. And that's when a lot of the founding fathers actually were really worried about the different emerging dialects of the different regions tearing apart this fragile union. And, we see that same talk echoed today where people are worried. So for example, Benjamin Franklin was extremely antagonistic to German input into English and French, and made some really hostile comments that if you read them today, they could sound like a modern speaker talking about Spanish. So it's the same fear of, foreign influence on English tearing the nation apart. Obviously, it didn't do that in Benjamin Franklin's time. Instead, German and French became part of the American dialect story. And the same thing is happening today, where Spanish is becoming part of the American dialect story. But it's an inspiring of fear when it happens. And it's just funny when you think about, in the long view of history, how we've had the same fear, with all different groups that have come in, from the French and the Germans early on to the Italians and the Irish a little later. And now it's Spanish that's doing it. But so far, English has survived quite well.
Well, and what you were saying about I found this part really interesting because you're talking about, historically, but also in current times. And I see this all the time with people who I know where the parents came to North America from somewhere else, but the kids don't have an accent like their parents. The kids have an accent like the people who they're around. So I presume that's, I forget, you have a name for it, but it's something about like the 3 generations of how long it takes for the accent. And so I'm just imagining in early America a similar thing, like the parents came from this part of England with a really strong accent, but their kids are growing up around people from different places, different classes. So the kids would be the ones, like each generation, that's how the new accent is kind of developing. Is that correct?
Exactly. It's called the 3-generation pattern that happens. And we find this overwhelmingly whenever someone from some place lands in a new place that has a different language. We find that it's within 3 generations that the original language tends to disappear. And that's absolutely happening with Spanish. In fact, the university I teach at is a Hispanic serving institution. So we have a lot of second generation students, second generation Spanish speaking students. And they often tell me that, they're really the third, a lot of times the 3rd generation. So their parents might have moved here when they were very young, but basically they're also predominantly English speakers, but it's their grandparents they talk to in Spanish. And they always complain to me about how embarrassed they are about their Spanish. They never complain to me about how embarrassed they are about their English because they are English speakers. But by the 3rd generation, the source language tends to die out. And that's happened over and over in time. And that continues to happen in actually recent analysis of American sort of immigration shows the exact same pattern with Spanish, that it's very frequent by the 3rd generation of children that there's no Spanish at all. But what can remain are substrate influences, we call them, which means there are very subtle ways that source languages can affect the way that certain sounds are pronounced or certain grammatical structures that get fossilized or sort of stick around in speech of children who don't speak that language but pick up small traits. And, if you've ever watched Fargo, and the Minnesota accent, that's actually a substrate influence left over from Scandinavian influence. So most people that speak with that accent don't speak any Scandinavian languages, but they speak an accent that was influenced by Scandinavian languages. And that's typically what we see stick around, but not the language itself. But I'm a perfect example. My parents are both native French speakers, and they moved to the United States as adults. I was born in the US, and clearly I don't sound French, but there were little aspects of their speech that I did pick up. And some of them I got teased about in school. And so I kind of learned to eradicate them. So I didn't pronounce H sounds, which French doesn't have H. So, words like huge, I would say huge. I got teased. Little 5-year-olds are merciless with differences. And so I got teased about it. And I started aspirating my H's just because of, fear of embarrassment. But there are still little traits that I have that have a little bit of a French tinge in the substrate cause. But basically what happens is around age 4 or 5, when you leave the home and you go into a school setting or a community setting where there's a peer group, and at that time you're intellectually able to see the world as not always about you, right? So we move our center from ourselves as we become more psychologically kind of sophisticated. We start to see that there are other people and they have their own theories of mind. So they're not the same mind as mine, which young babies don't have that. So they're just sort of learning what's in their environment, and it's part of, they see no separation between them parents and themselves. They're picking up their parents, basically English, whatever English that is. But as they go to school and they start to interact with other kids, well, other kids are way cooler than your parents. And so you start to realign towards the accent of the local community, towards your peer group. And we call that vernacular reorganization. And that starts as early as, 3 or 4 years old. So, which is why even a young child, if you were speaking another language up till age 2, and then you come and you're in a new language environment, by the time you're an adult, no one will know that you ever lived elsewhere. So my brother, for example, didn't speak English when my parents moved here. He's 5 years older than me, but they moved here when he was 2 or 3, and he spoke French and Hungarian. Now he speaks neither French or Hungarian, and he has a completely American accent. So it's this reorganization that happens when you adjust to the peer group. And children are incredibly versatile in learning language because their brains and their mouths are not pre-wired to another language like adults are. So we, have already sort of set in these patterns, both in terms of our motor control, also in terms of how we've intellectualized the sounds of our language. But babies are born, essentially a linguistic blank slate in that regard. They don't have another competing system. But also there's some evidence that suggests their brain is wired differently than adults, that once it lateralizes, it changes, and that their brains are more attuned to picking up language. And therefore you have this double whammy of, youth and vigor in learning language, and also nothing to compete with it. And that's why children are incredible sponges of the sounds of their environment and the sounds of the cool people in their environment, which are definitely not their parents. So that's why they don't have accents like their parents.
And now for a quick advertising break.
Starting or growing your own business can be intimidating and lonely at times. Your to-do list may feel endless with new tasks, and lists can easily begin to overrun your life. So finding the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything as a built-in business partner can be a game changer. For millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US. From household names like Gymshark, Rare Beauty, and Heinz, to brands just getting started. Shopify has hundreds of ready-to-use templates that can help you build a beautiful online store that matches your brand's style. And you can tackle all the important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool that you need. And if people haven't heard about your brand, you can get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you, with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns to reach customers wherever they're scrolling or strolling. Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify, and start hearing. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/realm. Go to shopify.com/realm. That's shopify.com/realm.
Membership means more with American Express Business Gold. Earn 4 times membership rewards points in your top 2 eligible spending categories every month, including eligible U.S. advertising purchases and select media, and U.S. purchases at restaurants, including takeout and delivery. What are you waiting for? Get the card that flexes with your spending every month. Terms and points cap apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-gold. Amex Business Gold Card. Built for business by American Express.
Tomorrow morning is knocking. Stock your fridge now. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or a sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
You may think you know McDonald's drinks, but you don't know them like this. From fruity refreshers like the Strawberry Watermelon Refresher and the Mango Pineapple Refresher with popping boba, to crafted sodas like the Sprite Berry Blast with berry-flavored Sprite topped with cold foam. Who knew ice-cold drinks could be so fire? 6 all-new drinks are here. Try them all, now at McDonald's. Refreshers contain caffeine.
And we're back. Well, no, and I'm just picturing the same thing. I mean, like, because humans are humans, and it's not that long ago, relatively speaking, that if we're talking about the 1600s, 1700s, like early American colonists, like the exact same thing would be happening. Like kids would be around people with other accents, and that's where like these regional accents are developing.
Absolutely, right? So you are a community, right? Especially then, we're looking at a time when, we're talking about many, many fewer people than we have today in a city. Their townships or their villages were far smaller and more interactive, right? There was an incredible need for a collective action, collective work, collective parenting. And therefore, these kids would have had intense interaction with other children born probably to parents speaking different dialects, if not different languages. And so they needed to find common ground. So it's really in children that the accents change. So their parents didn't level the speech. So their parents died with the same accents they probably came with, but their children sounded nothing like them. So that's why within one generation, when travelers came and experienced the New World, they were stunned at the leveling of the British accent because they were listening to the kids, right? And, within 18 years, you have a whole new set of accents. So it's pretty rapid when it happens in a setting that's so intensely distinct like the colonies were.
Well, and something you talk about in the book as well, and I've heard so many theories about this. I'm curious for you to share your theory about this. People often like to think about, well, what did people sound like in Shakespeare's time? Like when the original Shakespeare plays were coming out, what was that accent? And I've heard various different people claim, well, actually they sound like this. Actually, this is the accent that's the most similar to that. Can you talk about what your findings are about what currently today is the closest sound to what Shakespeare would have sounded like?
Yeah, I think that it's so funny. It's a funny thing. People really have this view that there still exists some Shakespearean English. And my answer would be there's no accent that is alone itself like the Shakespearean accent because so much has changed. They've just changed in different ways. So a lot of times we've heard, Appalachian accents are sort of Shakespeare in the holler. That's been a long-standing fallacy. Because certain things like prefixing, so I'm a hunting and a fishing, that form, and multiple modals. So when you say I might could, those are older features that are relic features. So they're retained in certain dialects, namely in Appalachian dialects still today. And those have been lost in other ones. So people then point to, oh, look, so they're, Shakespearean in their speech. And multiple negation is another one. In the 1600s, Shakespeare used a lot of multiple negation. It was okay to do at the time. It wasn't a pariah like it is today. So
that's like to say, like, I'm not going to not do that.
I'm not, ain't nobody doing nothing. That kind of thing, right? Yeah. And ain't is also a relic feature, right? It was very prominent in the 1600s among people of all different social classes. It gradually became more associated with lower class speech, but it wasn't at that time. It was pretty prevalent. We find it in aristocratic speech as well. So you could point to all those features as being archaic features or relic features, but no more so in the sense of any features being able to be pointed to that were around then and maybe died out in some accents, but not others, would be relic features. So, if you go to North Carolina, there are some Irish verb forms like bees that you can also find in Newfoundland, where they also retain those, right? Where the bees, isn't that one of the...
Sorry, as a Canadian, I need to say it's Newfoundland.
Newfoundland. Okay. I have a problem. That one always kills me. I'm always like, am I wrong in pronouncing it? So Newfoundland.
Everybody says it wrong. Newfoundland.
Newfoundland. Okay. Newfoundland. Perfect. Anyway, there was a lot of Irish settlement there. So we find a sort of striking similarity, actually, when you look at relic features that exist in that accent and some in North Carolina, because there was also a lot of Irish settlement there. So those also are relic features. So it's hard to ever pinpoint one accent or one dialect as having more of those than any other. Those are more noticeable because the relic features that other varieties of American English have. So things like saying the ah vowel. Ah is actually an older vowel than ah. So when you say, aunt, that's an older pronunciation than aunt. Aunt is only basically a 19th century pronunciation. So while we think of that as, very British, it's actually not. Aunt was the original British form, and that's what was brought over with the colonists. But the difference is there are more Americans that have ah and not ah. So it doesn't feel like a relic feature to us. Saying fall and autumn is the same thing, right? A fall is an archaic term. So we don't point to, someone from, Chicago and say, oh my God, they're a relic speaker because they're saying those, but they are relic forms. It's just that it's more widely shared. So, it's a really interesting kind of tease out what were older forms and what weren't. But what we find is it's a hodgepodge. So every English accent has some features that are relics and some that aren't. They may differ. And the ones that we tend to say, oh, that's more Shakespearean are simply ones that accent A doesn't have, but accent B does. But accent A has other ones that are maybe more widely shared that are also relics. So I would say there is no accent existent today that sounds like it. And in fact, one of the reasons is if you go back and look at some of the early transcripts of, like trials, the Salem witch trials, or early documents written in colonial English, which is the only way we have to understand what sounded like what back then, or rhyme schemes. So I know the Crystals, Ben and David Crystal, have done a lot with Shakespearean rhyme schemes by, trying to sort of what would have rhymed at the time.
Yeah.
And that's how they reconstruct. And they're fabulous. So if you ever want to hear more what Shakespearean English sounded like, I would say they are the sources that you should probably look to. But what we find is a lot of the speech features that we would think of as sort of rustic or rural or uneducated today are what Shakespearean English would have sounded more like, which I think surprises people. So if this classy, sophisticated received pronunciation that almost all movies that have sort of Victorian settings sound like, right? You see and you feel, oh, look how elegant and sophisticated. Well, if you go back 100 years before that, no, they would have sound rustic and rural and dumb to you, because that is a lot of the features that would have been part of Shakespearean English. And, one of the things, for example, is the ax for ask pronunciation. That was really prevalent in 1600. And so, and winter instead of window, things like that, naked instead of naked. All of these things are actually what you would have been hearing around you. And Sari instead of Sarah, dafter for daughter, right? These are all actually archaic forms that would have been Shakespearean English-esque of that time period. But if you said them today, people would look at you funny. They wouldn't think, oh my God, that's so elegant and Shakespearean. They would think, oh my God, so rustic and dumb. So it's really funny that the reality of what it would have sounded like and what we have in our imagination about what it would have sounded like are completely different.
I've always thought that this is funny, that when people do Hollywood, or I guess especially Britain, they do any film set in a historical time period with classy people. So if it's like ancient Rome, it's like they all have the received British pronunciation, because it's so funny, classy people. But what you're explaining, what you talk about in the book, is like that received British pronunciation is like a fairly recent accent, but it's like, no, we have to show that these are classy olden times people. So, and if they're not classy, then it's Cockney. It's like these Cockney. I don't know. I recently watched I, Claudius. Do you know the old 1970s series? So it's set in ancient Rome, and all of the Roman senators, it's Patrick Stewart, isn't it? People are all talking in these received British pronunciation, and then the workers are like, "Oi there!" Like the workers are literally Cockney, but it's ancient Rome. But it's just a shorthand for audiences, I think, to be like, these are classy people. And if anyone, and I think some people have tried to do or have done, costume dramas using what would probably be a more authentic accent, the audiences are just like, that's not right. They sound too modern. Right. They sound too American. Right.
That's
Yeah.
actually, I was asked one time to help on a movie where they were trying to go back into early American accents a couple hundred years, and they wanted it to be authentic. But then when I was teaching them what it would have been more authentic at that time, they were like, no, we can't get away with that. People would hate that. It's just not, it's not what you think. It's not, because that image I think people have is that classy accent, and it just would have sounded quite different. And you have to remember too, literacy is a relatively new thing. So this, tie we have to what classy is actually a fairly new one tied to literacy. And, prior to the mid to late 1800s, literacy was not widespread. And so, women, for example, particularly would not have been taught to read and write prior to that. And so a lot of times their speech would have been more similar to some of the working class, or what they didn't have a working class at the time, the lowborn people, because that's who they spend a lot of their time with in terms of servants and things like that. And in fact, when we track language change in the 1700s, a lot of times we find that women's letters, if they did have some literacy and they were able to write some, they wrote how they spoke, and that their pronunciations of things and their usages were very similar to some of the laborers and sort of, they didn't really have a middle class at that time, but people of non-highborn rank. So a lot of the innovations that were introduced in that speech found their way into women's speech as well of the era. But we find that less common in educated men's speech. And that's because they were the ones that were highly literate. So they were much more tied to the pronunciations that they saw written in texts.
So what do you think about, today, when people are being prescriptive and saying something like saying X instead of ask, and how that's looked down upon as like, well, that's people who are sort of grammatically, people who develop an accent because of where they live, and that's just how they speak. And then for that accent to be looked down upon and for those people to be seen as lesser, when, like, how would you explain in the most kind way, like, actually, this is, everyone just talks like how they talk, like there's not one correct way?
I think, one of the things I try to do in the book is show how a lot of these features came to be, and that they have the same origin story as the things we think are high class. There's really not a difference. It's not like one is an uneducated bastardization of another, which is sort of the thought, right? That axe is a mispronunciation rather than the fact that it's actually an alternative pronunciation that has existed since the time of Old English. And in fact was used widely in well-regarded texts at the time. So Chaucer used axe quite frequently. Early Bible translations used axe quite frequently. And so, it's really just getting people to understand the history behind why we think certain speech features are better, are sort of more elite than others, and getting them to kind of untangle this idea of goodness with certain speech forms, because there can be certainly speech forms that are preferred socially. And that's really what standard speech is. It's a social preference for a form of speech. And that preference for the type of English that we consider standard today really started in the 1800s in Britain. And it simply is a certain style of speech that was the ones that the elite or the wealthy class of London spoke, and that got elevated to what we consider standard English. But there's a difference between having a social preference for something and saying, okay, because we like this better, we're going to elevate this variety so that we want to use this in institutions and teach it in school and have it in professional contexts. That's a separate thing entirely than to say, well, that means that everybody who doesn't speak this somehow speaks something wrong or something incorrect or something that is a bad attempt, that they're dumb.
Don't know any better. Yeah.
And I think it's the tie-in because we teach standard English in schools that we don't realize that that doesn't mean that that's the variety that was always spoken or the variety that's actually linguistically more superior. It's simply the variety that had been selected by those in power at one point in time when schools were getting established to be the one taught there. And the other thing we don't think about is when you go to school as a standard English background speaker, so when you grow up in a middle-class white family in America, you're going to have a variety that more closely aligns to that. So your job at school is a lot easier, right? There's no mismatch between it. So you're not learning more. You're simply starting with more that's aligned with those norms. But when you come as a second language speaker with parents that are not from this country, or you are an African American English speaker coming from an African American English speaking background, or you're a working class speaker coming from a working class background, when you go to school, the norms of your speech and the norms of what's taught in school don't align as easily, and we don't do anything to help that. We don't have any kind of ways of saying, look, these are just different systems and yours is completely valid, but in this context, here's the language basically that we're teaching, and here are some rules that can help you make that leap. Right, here are some readers that can show you where the differences lie. We don't teach it that way. We just assume, okay, you guys have a dumb accent and therefore you need to just forget it and learn this one. And I mean, not only is that sort of socially wrong because it's shaming people for something that shouldn't be shamed at all, but it's also ineffective from a pedagogical standpoint because children don't learn effectively that way. You're not giving them the tools and the scaffolding to learn. You're also making them feel bad about their own speech rather than good about learning an alternative variety that can help them be successful in other contexts. So there really has to be a reshaping of thinking about how we approach teaching standard English if we want to overcome that, which I think is the goal, right? That people, when they look at reading failure rates and things like that in schools, if you want to improve those, well, then you have to think outside the box in terms of how to do it.
I thought that was such a fascinating point. And just listeners, pick up her book to get all the information about this. But things like I'm picturing someone with like how you describe the African-American accent. If you say like, I'm a go to the store, and then that kid goes to school and they have a reader and it says, I am going to the store. It's like, that's not what they're saying. So why would they... That's the sort of example you're saying, right? Where it's just like the way that they're speaking is not the words that are being shown. So there's a dissonance between... A
bigger mismatch, right? Especially, yes, because written English, which is a different skill than spoken English, right? So writing is something we all learn. Speaking is something we have. So you're born basically talking. So by one, you're making sounds, but you're not reading, right? That's something you learn that someone has to actually teach you actively. And then we don't realize that actually the letters the graphemes we use to represent English in written form are much more aligned with standard English forms. And therefore, it's a lot easier to learn to read because there's not as much mismatch. And there has been a program that was developed by a linguist by the name of Bill LeBeau that actually tried to remedy that by using readers that helped sort of scaffold those differences for non-native speakers, or really it was more for inner city African-American children that he was developing this for. And those schools that implemented that saw a rise in reading rates. So it was actually effective because it helped point out, okay, in your dialect, this is spelled this way. This would be how it would be written. In standard English writing, this is how it would be written. So look for that correspondence. That's how it's written. And, you're providing some clues versus just, hey, kid, you're not doing it right. Figure it out, which is really the way we teach it.
So your book, this episode is coming out the same week your book is published. So Why We Talk Funny, the real story behind our accents. If people want to keep up with you, do you have events and launches and things that people might be able to attend?
I do. I have a newsletter that I send out a lot of times summarizing those events that people can sign up for on my website, which is valeriefridland.com. And I'm doing a event at the Dearborn Library. I think it's on the week following the book's publication, which I'll have the dates in that newsletter. So I don't tend to put the dates up on my website. I just send those out because they change so rapidly and I'm really lame at updating. So what I do is I just send out a newsletter. So the best way, I do have a number of appearances on live television and in events, reading events or sort of Q&A events that people can sign up for virtually. But the best way to find out about that is signing up for my newsletter that comes out. And I don't send them out often, like once every month or two at most. So you will not be flooded in your inbox. But if you are interested in joining some of those, then check out valeriefridland.com and just sign up for the newsletter.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming back on this podcast. I am you can probably tell I'm really fascinated by language and linguistics and accents. And I think that having books like yours that are really written for the everyday person, it's not like a really heightened academic book. It's accessible. And I think that's so important for people to learn. Just for me, what really matters to me is just like to not be so judgmental about how people speak and to understand that every accent, every dialect is fine. Like you don't have to judge and write mean comments about my podcast.
Exactly. Please do not send mean comments. Anne does not deserve them. She sounds wonderful.
I have a Canadian accent, and that's okay. And that just surprises people sometimes. A couple of my word pronunciations, people are like, "Oh, you said that wrong." I'm like, "No, I didn't."
No, you said it exactly right for you. Yes, I personally love your accent. As someone with Canadian background, I absolutely adore the Canadian vowel system. But yes, people are judgy. And it's sort of the funny thing is they're judging based on beliefs that they have that are erroneous and historically invalid. So, I'm not to shame people, but if you just step outside of what you've been sort of taught in school and learn the actual history behind the evolution of so many things in accents you hear around you, not only is it a fascinating story and journey to take, it's also incredibly illuminating with sort of understanding how you have been kind of with blinders over your eyes about how language comes to exist in the beautiful variety it does today. And I think it can be useful no matter what your goal is, whether it's you want to be more understanding of accents or you simply want to understand the history of accents or you just find language fascinating. And the story of language is really the story of something universal. The things that drive us to differences are things that drive all of us to differences. It's just the way those differences turn out are slightly different, but the fundamental pressures that push us there are the same. So I think the story is actually one of unity and not division if we just learn how to look at it the right way.
Well, thank you so much, Valerie, for joining me, and best of luck with this book launch and everything.
Thank you so much, Anne. It was a joy coming here today.
So Valerie's book is available now, Why We Talk Funny, the real story behind our accents. You can get this as a book. You can also get this, as she mentioned in the podcast, as an audiobook with different narrators, with different accents, reading the different chapters, which is such a genius idea. I read the book as a book, and so I was imagining the accents, but I can see with the audiobook that would be an even more immersive experience. I think her work is so important, and I think it's so interesting. And now we all have a bunch of talking points when people complain about things like, why are there American accents in the Odyssey? It's like, well, first of all, why are they speaking English? Like, shouldn't they be speaking Greek? If you start going down this road, then you're never going to stop finding things to complain about. And isn't it more fun to just embrace the fact that people have different accents? Anyway, this is Vulgar History. My name is Anne Foster, and next week we have another exciting episode in store for you that I think you're really going to enjoy with a return guest who people are always asking to have back on the podcast. And actually, next week I'm going to have a very exciting announcement during the episode, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, remember, I also wrote a book. It's called Rebel of the Regency, The Scandal Saga of Caroline of Brunswick, Britain's Queen Without a Crown. Available also as a book, as an audiobook where I read the beginning and end of it. And you should read my book. And if you've read my book, please leave a nice 5-star rating on Goodreads or Storygraph, on Amazon or wherever you rate your books, because that helps more people find out about it. And the more people who find out about it, the better it is for everybody. And yeah, I can't wait for you to hear our next episode. You can keep up with me on Instagram or on Patreon, all the places where I am. Read Valerie's book. It's so good. And until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, scripted, and hosted by Anne Foster. Editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. Regency-era artwork by Karen Moynihan. Social media videos by Magdalena Denson. Transcripts of this podcast are available at vulgarhistory.com by Aveline Malik. You can get early, ad-free episodes of Vulgar History by becoming a paid member of our Patreon at patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter. Vulgar History merchandise is available at vulgarhistory.com/store for Americans and at vulgarhistory.redbubble.com for everyone else. follow us on social media at Vulgar History Pod. Get in touch with me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
The war is over, and both sides lost. Kingdoms were reduced to cinders, and armies scattered like bones in the dust. Now the survivors claw to what's left of a broken world, praying the darkness chooses someone else tonight. But in the shadow dark, the darkness always wins. This is old school adventuring at its most cruel. Your torch ticks down in real time, and when that flame dies, something else rises to finish the job. This is a brutal rules-light nightmare with a story that emerges organically based on the decisions that the characters make. This is what it felt like to play RPGs in the 80s, and man, it is so good to be back. Join the Glass Cannon podcast as we plunge into the Shadow Dark every Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern on youtube.com/theglasscannon, with the podcast version dropping the next day. See what everybody's talking about and join us in the dark.
There are vampires out there. They walk among you, shoulder to shoulder in the dark. Heading to work, heading home, going to the bar. It's a life just like anyone else's, and I have grown used to it. To the darkness, to the moon, to the taste of blood on my tongue. But vampires are dying out. We are a fading kind, and I am the first one created in so long, and that is a dangerous thing to be. Those who came before me, elders of all stripes, they do not want to see our kind gone, and they will do anything to keep their power. And for myself, and for Grace, who created me, that is a sword that hangs above our heads. And the worst person of all carries our secret, and he will use it however he sees fit. Who do you look to when things are at their darkest? From the creators of Parkdale Haunt comes Woodbine, a podcast about monsters, dreams, and changes, those you want and those you never saw coming. Season 2 arrives September 24th, distributed by Realm.